praise boss when morning work bells chime. Praise him for chunks of overtime. Praise him whose bloody wars we fight. Praise him, fat leech and parasite. All hell.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back for a special edition
Sometimes things just
of the Modjeska Simkins School of Human Rights Deeper Dive sessions. I'm, of course, Dr. Robert Green II, lead instructor for the Modjeska Simkins School. And this afternoon, I am pleased to introduce to the audience Dr. Kerry Taylor of the Citadel, who is not only a historian of Southern labor relations, but has also been on the front lines fighting for labor rights in the South as well. So he's, as the email says, not just an armchair labor historian, he is also a scholar activist in his own right. Dr. Taylor, welcome to our class this evening.
Thank you. Good to see everybody, and thanks for having me back.
Thank you. And of course, today we're going to view the documentary, The Uprising of 34. And before we got on this evening, I was talking to my colleagues about how I grew up in the South. I grew up in Georgia most of my life. My apologies. But I had never heard about any of this until I went to graduate school at Georgia Southern. And I was introduced to this documentary and to this story. And I wanted to ask Brett to just briefly talk about his own experience with the making of this documentary, because I think it's also illuminating in terms of how this history has not been forgotten, but has been instead suppressed on purpose.
Thank you, Dr. Green. The movie came to my attention when I got a call from the director, George Stoney, and it was at the Grow Building before the Progressive Network existed. I think it was in the late 80s. And Mr. Stoney told me he was making a film about the uprising, well, he was going to call it the Uprising of 34, but about the Great Textile Strike of 34, and about the killings of Honea Path, South Carolina, which I didn't know about. And then in looking into it and being interested in it and trying to find out more about it, I found out that the Honea Path fathers, maybe even some of the mothers, didn't want to talk about it, that it was terribly embarrassing that they had killed 7 of their own and wounded many, many people. And so it was a couple of years later, I think, when the film finally made it to public broadcasting system, PBS, and they showed it nationwide, everywhere except in South Carolina, where the killings happened, but also the only state of the nation that the legislature owns the entire educational broadcasting system. The legislature controls all 63 broadcasting licenses, and the educational quality that goes out at ETV is equal to the lowest IQ of the stupidest legislator. And so the next thing that we tried to do was to book a room in the Spartanburg County Technical School to show the film, and that was canceled. And so, Robert, this is an example, living example of Southern by the grace of God and stupid by choice. Thank you for the time.
Thank you. Well, I think, Dr. Taylor, did you have anything you wanted to add before we start the film? All right, then. Well, in that case, let's go ahead and start the film. And afterwards, we'll be around for what should be a lively and interesting question and answer session. So let's go ahead and start the film.
was just surprised that anybody wanted to unionize down here. We thought, you know, things were going along so great. Here's Daddy here running the mills and looking after you so good.
My grandmother told my mother that she would rather see her take my brother and me to the graveyard than to bring us to be brought up on the cotton mill village.
They thought that was the trash of the world, cotton mill folks, you know. Everybody thought it.
Say them old cooler mill, cotton mill trash, lint heads.
Lint heads? If that's what we are, a lint head, I'm proud to be one of them.
Call them lint heads, you call them every damn thing. It was a pretty good job if you think about it.
You just feel like you got somebody behind you pushing, wanting more and more and more to give you less and less. It's just a downright bad feeling.
We had a job for them if they wanted it. If they didn't, all they had to do was go back to the hills.
People too darn sorry to pay anybody enough to live on because they're afraid they're going to get a little bit ahead and then they can't get them to work for nothing. But like a man told me up in North Georgia, keep a man hungry and he'll work. That's the truth.
That kind of environment puts scars on people that they never heal. You live with those the rest of your life.
The union was certainly a dirty word around here, I can tell you that. And still is in Gaston County, and always will be, I guess.
It was on Labor Day in 1934 that I witnessed the closest thing that this country has had to a revolution. The General Textile Strike was one of the largest strikes in American history. It was the culmination of years of homegrown organizing and protest. For many Southern workers, it was the first time they had raised their voices as citizens to challenge the control of the mill owners.
I never remember the strike being brought up in school. It was like it was not to be mentioned. It was just like everybody was trying to keep everything quiet. Maybe it was just just trying to get away from the sadness, what they had gone through.
Never mentioned. Never mentioned. After that happened down there, union was never mentioned again. Till they know they killed him. They were afraid, and they still are afraid.
I can't understand why my dad didn't tell me. He could talk about the war and talk about people being blown to bits, but he couldn't talk about his neighbors being killed. And it's like somebody trying to hide a dirty secret about their family, like they're ashamed of what happened to their families. They ought to be proud of them. They stood up when other people wouldn't.
Yes, I was over there. I took a man's hat off his head, laying on the ground, and fanned him till he died, till the breath lifted. But I ain't got no more to say into it. I've been trying to forget about all of that, and it's just bringing it all back up.
So it's a hush thing. It's a keep quiet thing. Let's don't pull out our skeletons out of the closet. Let's let sleeping dogs lie.
I would imagine even a relative, me going to her and saying, Granny, talk to me. You know, what is this about a union? Her memories are so frightening of the periods that she's gone through that I'm not burdening a younger generation with the horror I went through.
It's the quietest thing I've ever known. I don't know, they may think that it will give their children a hard time.
I think some people suffered over it. We lost a strike. I think that hurt some. And organized labor in the South, in the whole, gets a dirty word.
It's rumors that there was a union back maybe in the 30s or somewhere back in there, but nobody will talk about it, and only to say, I will not be a part of this union because of what happened long time ago, but nobody tells you what happened long time ago. And I would like to know what happened and where's the history of it.
Where over 100,000 have quit their looms. Frequent clashes with troublemakers and scores of arrests marked the walkout.
I might have been in that crowd.
The crisis was growing graver as these films were issued.
It's familiar looking, but I don't know any of them. I can't recognize any of them. But it brings back a lot of memories. I was raised on a farm in Carroll County. My dad had always said that he wouldn't leave the farm, and he particularly didn't want to go to a cotton mill. That wasn't his dream. It was quite different from being your own boss and having a boss over you, and he had never had that, you see. He was a hard worker. And so he taught us to work. And I can remember the time when we had a lot of cotton to pick that year, and he would tease us and tell us to try to keep up with him, you know. He made good crops for several years, well on until I'll say 15, I believe I was about 15 years old. Anyway, it was in 1926. And in 1926, the boll weevils came along. I don't know how long they'd been around, but that's the year that they got my daddy's crop. When my daddy left the country, the only choice he had was to go to a cotton mill, and it broke his heart. We moved to the mill village. We had electric lights and running water, and I thought that was heaven on earth. That was the happiest I ever was, when I didn't have to go draw a bucket of water out of the well. And we could just turn on that faucet, and I just thought we were rich. I just knew we were rich. It took me a long time to think that we wasn't as half as well off as I thought we were.
My father remembered hiring these families that came from the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, and they needed the help in running the mills. And as the textile industry grew in the South, they had to have more employees. So from the mountains of North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee came many, but those people would not come unless you had a job for their mother and their father and their grandpa and their grandma. You had to provide jobs for all of those. So it was a family type of environment, and I think it was the type of environment that the workers liked and enjoyed. They felt comfortable in it.
Sometimes at night when I can't sleep, I'll go through and start at the top of the mill of the village, and I'll go down and see how many names I can get of the people who lived in the house when we lived over there. And sometimes it amazes me. I just about get them all. I miss a lot of it. I miss the friends that I had there and the camaraderie we had.
The blacks did not live in the mill village. They lived in this section and the other isolated black section. We didn't live in the white section. And there were very few black people around. Everybody stayed in the black village, what few there were. All the surrounding at the mill in uptown belonged to Cannon Mill, belonged to Mr. Cannon. The whole city belonged to Mr. Cannon.
Everything was owned by the company. All the stores, the drugstore, bank, every building was owned by the company, even the doctor's office.
Superintendent had control of the mill stores, and this is where people had to go buy their things, their groceries, their clothes. They would be so heavily in debt, they would owe their whole paycheck to him from week to week. Everything fell back to the mill, the lifeline of everything that those people lived went back to the Shakola Mill.
The mills not only built the housing for them, they either charged them no rent or very low rent. I think maybe 25 to 50 cents per room was charged at some time. They received coal free, and then when they had electricity later, they usually had electricity free, so it was a big plus for a family.
Living in the man's house that you worked for, he really had you under control. Because if you did anything that he didn't like, he could put you out of the house, take your job, and where were you going to go?
And you had to meet a certain standard of conduct too, because there was no drinking, no gambling, and no chasing around after somebody else's mate. If the officials heard about it, you was fired right then. So that's why it was such a good place to live.
My daddy was strictly rough on whiskey. He did have no use for whiskey. And if he caught you drinking, you had to move. That was the rule. They knew it before they started.
Well, I'd give them a chance. And that's what we used to do. We'd say if they were not doing the right thing, drinking too much or that and that, and wouldn't come regular work, we'd give them so much time to move out. And we'd move them out.
Fortunately, I was from a family that had a little something to begin with, being a mill owner's son. But some of these kids that were coming to school with me, and I'm ashamed to tell you, we teased some of them too. I'm ashamed to say it now. But Lord, they were just coming barefooted and maybe not even a sandwich to eat for the day. That's the part that I remembered.
But people had to take their children out of school as soon as they became old enough to work. So a lot of people never got an education because of that. They had to go to work to help support the family.
I was just a child, but I remember. The superintendent, he didn't allow you to climb a tree. We slept and climbed trees, and he had John Strange to tell on us. He'd have him to watch us. And he'd tell on you if you climbed a tree. If you didn't go to church, he wouldn't hire you.
Management wanted the workers to be in churches because they felt the churches domesticated the workers, that they would keep them from getting too uppity. And so that's why there seemed to be a hand-in-glove relationship between management and many of the churches.
Churches existed in the mill villages, but they were owned by the management along with everything else.
Some of the superintendents were very, very tough on it. And if you didn't go to church, they'd fire you. But we never had that.
On Sunday, outside of church, about the only entertainment we had was to take pictures. Maybe go up to the cemetery or out in the mill yard and take pictures with a Kodak. That's a black lady, Aunt Eliza. She washed for my grandmother when my grandmother's children were small. And then when my mother grew up, she would come over and wash for us.
the early 30s, there weren't any black women in the mill at that time. They did not hire black women in the mill. And we worked for the people that worked in the mill villages. And we took care of their house, took care of the children, and did their work while they worked in the mill. That was our occupation at that time.
They didn't have to pay them very much.
They just practically raised the children. You could take your black hands and you could stir it in their dough or in their foods, and you could take your black body and lay in the bed with the child and protecting it, but you couldn't come in their front door, right? You weren't worthy to come in their front door.
We had black domestic help, poor as we were. Of course, the blacks being on the bottom of the social ladder at that time, there was no place they could work except, they couldn't work in the mill, by the way. They couldn't come past a bale breaker, I don't believe.
I went to work when I was 13 years old at the Modena cotton mill. That was around about 1926, somewhere along in there, I think, about that time. I worked in the warehouse. We never did get to run no machine, though. No way, we didn't get to run no machine.
Were there any black spinners or weavers or loom fixers back then?
No. I did not went not in the mill where I was.
Did you ever wonder why there wasn't?
I don't know. Do you know? I don't know. Wonder why.
Yeah.
Do you wonder why?
I have a pretty good idea.
Well, why?
They wanted to save the jobs for the white man.
All right. That's what I think. I just letting you say it first.
Yeah. Yes, I'm afraid that was what it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a lot of good white friends, and they'd come out and tell us about their boss man, how they treat them, and everything. But we never did. There wasn't nothing we could do. There wasn't nothing to tell us. There wasn't nothing we could do about it. But they just wanted to get it off the chest, I reckon.
So we all just had a big time. We'd fight some, we'd love some, and everything run smooth. And it was no money, but we didn't know what money was no way. We never had any, so we wasn't used to it. But we were all happy.
The mill village that I grew up on, we could hear the machinery at the mill. And you can even smell the yarn. I always loved to smell it, you know. And at night the mill would be all lit up, you know, and I could see the lights from my bedroom window. And I wouldn't have grown up anywhere else in the world.
The first experience I guess I had with the mill was when I was slipping in at night and learning. The machines made a lot of noise, and when you talked to somebody who worked close to you, you had to talk real loud. People were dipping snuff and they spit in the floor, and it was filthy. And you worked 12 hours a day, and you were dirty when you came out.
I've heard people call them met heads, you know. It didn't sound too nice to me.
Well, we did. It was cotton work that we worked with, you know.
Lint would get in your hair.
It was all in the plant, you know. It'd fly around.
It got in your hair too.
Yeah, get in your hair, on your clothes. But
we didn't want to be called that.
Calling lint heads, and I found out that the one that work in the mill, see, they call them, a lot of them, white trash. You know, I've heard the other people, other whites that was a little above them, call them white trash.
The textile culture was a tough culture, and the people who ran it and people who worked in the mills in the old days had to be tough and hardy people, and that included the mill owners and the managers, the foremen and the executives who ran the mills. I remember my uncle, long before dawn, he would be at the Muskogee Manufacturing Company and going through the mill. And this was in the era of management by personal appearance. You walked through the mill and you spoke to the employees, and some people would say that it was for paternalistic motives. Others would say it was out of genuine concern.
My father hired them, and they worked from 6 o'clock in the morning till 6 in the afternoon. They had a place to live, and it was just a better life than they was having on the farm. And wonderful people. It was just one big family in the mill village. But whoever was in charge had to be in charge.
The boss said we had to be saving with the toilet paper. And the boss told us to be real saving, not use no more than we had to. They told us if they caught us wasting the paper, they was going to lay us off. So I got me a corn cob at the house, carried it over to the plant. We tied the string around it and drove a nail up at the back of the commode and put a sign, big sign, use this cob and save your job. And the boss said if he ever found out who did that, he was going to fire him. And I was scared to death.
I remember one night that part of the spinning room was a huge spinning room. In fact, they had 2 spinning rooms. And the spooling room was in the middle. And for some reason or other, we had 2 types of yarn in the spinning room, and they didn't need it. And he shut down and he cut out the lights. And right there in the mill, the bosses took girls back there during that time. I know that went on.
It was pretty rough on some of them girls that went in there, and it was a shame they didn't take them out and shoot them. That's exactly what they were done, to take them out and shoot them. Well, I looked at it, but things like that happens in places like this.
I enjoyed working for them. They were good to us. Well, you didn't know any better, did you? No. It's the only place you'd ever been. Went down Brookshire Mill to get me a job away down yonder in a cotton mill yard. It's hard times in this old mill, hard times I know.
We were all lucky to have a job. That's the way we looked at it back in those days.
We were already beginning to have a weak economic situation in the South, really beginning in about 25. We began to go downhill. And we were already moving down by the time we had the Depression in 1929. Now, of course, 29 finished off everybody.
I looked out the window a lot of time, and on Monday morning you'd see 30, 40, 50 people out there standing around trying to find a job. I used to walk down the railroad and see box cars come by, people from up north coming down this way hunting jobs, and people down this way going up north hunting jobs. It was hard to find one. Things was bad along there.
My mill went on a short time. We was working two days one week, 3 the next, and we was dividing it up, everybody. We didn't use seniority, this didn't work, and that was laid off. And you didn't have the unemployment insurance and stuff like that thing. And so they was dividing it up. You worked 2 days. And we had a pretty rough time of it.
in the Great Depression. The cotton mills prided themselves on their paternalism, and I think there was some justification. I think they provided a lot of amenities and that sort of thing that they didn't have to provide.
Back in the early part of the Depression, there were 3 mills in this town. 2 of them closed down. This mill ran 2 shifts a week. Wasn't much, but it paid us enough to buy firewood and cornmeal and fatback to feed our families. The mill didn't make any money. We made the cloth and stored it.
The country was troubled. Every group in the society, from the richest, the most powerful, to the common man, and to the most deprived, were all uncertain as to what the future would be. There was a sense that a new administration was coming in, and that would bring a new world into being.
We were trying to get over the Depression, and Roosevelt was our gleam of hope with what he called a New Deal. And people said we got to do better than we have done.
Roosevelt's theme song was, "Happy days are here again." Well, we took him at his word. Happy days are here again. And all the way through, when we went to the polls to vote for him, we were all singing, "Happy days are here again," because Roosevelt's going in.
When Roosevelt got elected, well, he was a man that people had confidence in. You know, he said, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself." Well, people loved that. And they'd have those fireside chats that they called it.
And we had a radio. Many people did not have radios, but other people would come to sit around that one radio and listen to the chats that Franklin Roosevelt would give on the radio. And we were happy to know he came out with several supposed to be programs. And NRA was one of them. I could hear people talking about this man has a grip on what is needed to help our country.
The National Industrial Recovery Administration, the Blue Eagle, was to stimulate the economic recovery of this country. And they were seeking various ways of achieving stability. The Cotton Textile Code was the first adopted.
Set a minimum wage of 25 cents an hour. When they set that wage, my rate was 17 cents an hour, and I thought I was going to get rich. I just going to have more money than I knew what to do with it at 25 cents an hour.
The second thing that the code contained was a 40-hour week, which became the standard.
We'd work 8 hours instead of from 6 to 6. It was some hard work, but you know, everybody was stout then.
There were all kinds of miscellaneous provisions. One was, for example, the prohibition against child labor below 16. There were provisions for safety and health codes. And of course, most outstandingly was what was called Section 7A, which provided that workers had a right to organize, to select their own representative, and the employers were not to interfere with their organization nor coerce them in any way.
Organizing in the textile mills didn't really start with Section 7A. It had started earlier than that in places like Elizabethton, Marion, and Gastonia, North Carolina. But all their attempts over there were futile, and no wonder they were. The bosses were against them. We had no protection whatever. But when we got Section 7A, then we had protection, and we felt that we had that right to organize. And along with those rights, we were given dignity. Well, we considered it dignity when we were no longer called cotton mill hands and lint heads. We're textile workers.
Hey, boss man, won't you hear me when I call? You're not so big, you're just tall, that's all.
The first thing we did at Cherokee, where I worked, we put some notices on a billboard down there that we were going to have a meeting. And the bosses came around right after that and tore them all down. And we knew then that they were not for what we were doing, which was trying to do what we had been given a right to do.
The Cotton Textile Code was approved in July '33, and complaints of nonconformance and stretch out and loss of wages were beginning to be filed. Workers were looking for help from the national administration to enforce the code.
Where we got the idea of writing to Roosevelt was, we would hear this over the radio, you know, in that very, very nice voice that he had. If you have any problems, you can always refer them to your president. Well, we took him at his word.
Dear Sir, Mr. Roosevelt, we know that you are doing everything in your power to help the poor people, but we know that you do not know what all is going on in these mills, and we thought we would let you know, for we think it is our place to do our part in helping you. We have to work so hard in this mill in Belmont, NC, that we do not get time to stop and eat our lunch, and if we do, our work just tears all to pieces, and they have to get the machinery speeded up so fast that they make as much production in 7.5 hours as they would in 12 hours, and I think something ought to be done about it.
My co-workers, and myself too, of course, we were writing letters all the time. We would write them to President Roosevelt, to Mrs. Roosevelt, to our congressman, to our senator, and to Hugh Johnson.
General Hugh H. Johnson, Administrator of Public Work Program, Washington, D.C. Sir General Johnson, will there be any work for colored people in South Carolina under the new wage scale? In the South, I noticed that the newspaper, that cleaners and outside help is not considered the code of the mill. General Johnson, please look out for the colored people as a whole in South Carolina and see that colored be benefited by the raising wages on the new plan. There's a letter from Mr. Neely. He signed it.
Oh yeah, we had blue eagles all over the mill. But according to management, that still didn't give us the right to organize.
Dear Sir, on Monday, September the 4th, a number of operatives reported for work on the first shift and were told that they could not use them anymore. Practically all that were laid off were members of the labor union, which they are just beginning to organize. We want to organize and support the NRA, do our part, and stand by our president. And we would appreciate it if the wheels could be kept turning.
The bosses didn't think that that applied to them. And they were still, we're management, you're our workers, you're our hands. And they were still of the same attitude. Our attitude and our definition of it was different from what theirs was.
Textile workers, they were looking for a new world, a world in which they could say something about how they lived, what their pay was, what their conditions were, and whether or not lint would continue to float all over the mill there and continue to be called lint heads as we were in those days. They didn't like that kind of world.
In the early days of trying to organize the textile workers, the union is organized, was pretty well left up to the rank and filers. And we would get groups to go into different areas where we was trying to get other mills to organize.
We had a system of volunteer organizers.
we gave them a card. I say we, the United Textile Workers, gave them a card, and right at the top of it, it said volunteer organizer.
And our job was to sign the people up in the union, and then we would give the people a charter to organize that plant.
We'd been reading about unions being organized at other places in other cities, and we just talked about it. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know anything about unions, but a union organizer, he was a railroad boilermaker of all things, came into Knoxville to organize the mills here. He just told us what we needed to do was get 7 people to sign a charter and apply to the AF&L, and we'd get a charter, and then we could start organizing around that, which we did. We couldn't talk in the mill because it was too noisy. So what we would do, we would talk in the restroom or on the way home. And I would tell one person, and she'd tell another, and that's the way we spread the word around.
We had some people come to our house that were our neighbors and our friends, and they told my daddy that if he didn't join, he was just still thinking about it. If he didn't join, he would be very sorry. And my daddy just reached back and got his shotgun, and he told him, look, you can talk to me about it and explain it to me. You can ask me if I'd like to join, but you don't tell me that I've got to join.
Oh, we had people that would put up a fuss. But I realized then what it was. They were afraid. They were afraid of losing their job. And we had these workers there that still felt that loyalty to the management.
And they never did organize with us. They tried a lot of times, but our people and I was always close to my people. That's the reason I enjoyed it. So I worked with them when they started, and they were just family to me. And we tried to be honest with them. We gave them everything. And then when these outside people came in to try to organize, most of them just shook their head and said, listen, we don't need you. We're doing all right. And they never organized a single one of our mills.
The maddest I ever saw my father was a man and his wife got thrown out of a company-owned house because their daughter joined the union. And they were told, if you can't control your daughter, you're not the kind of employee we need, and we're going to make an example out of you. It took courage to buck the system.
Yeah, if I get into this box here. Yeah, let me find my union book. Here it is. Now this is my union book that they gave me when I joined the union. And we were just trying to get the union then in the mill. And when I got that union card, I was proud of it.
Well, we figured that we could organize like some of the unions in the North and become strong enough to sustain our positions, and we could get a reasonable agreement with the companies on everything. When we first started organizing, we met over the company store in what was at that time also a theater. And finally, the company gave us orders not to use their hall. So we built a hall over on a hill, not too far from the village. Well, it felt good, thinking we were going to have a place now. We thought it'd be there forever.
Well, to tell you the truth, we didn't have too many union meetings. Because if we would have one, they had people, the company would have people that knew the folks, and they'd be standing on the other side of the street watching, say, taking names. That's right.
My fiance, John, and his organizers were not afraid of the public knowing about it. He really believed in the Union, that he lived it and slept it, and sometimes he didn't sleep it. He stayed up all night talking the Union. He believed in so much he was doing, they put it in the Spartanburg directory so everybody could see it. The United Textile Workers of America, local number 1881, that was my husband's local. United Textile Workers of America, local number 2145, parentheses a C, which means colored, meets Saturdays at 10 a.m. That's on Liberty Street. That was a colored street.
I heard some black people did get involved in the union. Didn't ever talk to me about it.
Colored people was kind of scared to say anything because they wanted a job. So they was very careful about what they said and who they said it to. Because you don't ever know who you're talking to when they got a thing like that going.
We didn't try to organize the blacks because there's only a few in a mill. But if you want to join the union, we'll give you a membership card. And we'll give you a charter. But we can't do any more than that now.
Mr. Hugh S. Johnson, dear sir, I have been getting $9 per week for 67 hours per week ever since June the 17th of 33. The way I understand the code, every man, regardless of color, was supposed to get 8 hours per day, minimum wage $12 per week. 8 of us colored boys working long hours for $9 per week, and some white workers for $7.60 per week. I'm writing you a few lines for instruction. Sincerely yours, Claudia Hunter, Gunville, Alabama, and my father.
I think management misjudged the Southern workers, that they didn't know that they were shrewd enough to know that they had laws here and that those laws were being violated. We thought that we had these elected representatives in Washington and that if we wrote to them that something would happen. We definitely did. We thought something would happen, and particularly when we got answers back from the letters. And usually those letters, I think they all said the same thing, that they would investigate it. Just a real political letter.
There was no real judicial system for enforcing the codes, and that's one of the great weaknesses which existed in the early NIRA. The only enforcement authorities that were the code authorities, and the members of the code authorities were almost uniformly, exclusively employers, so that they were very lukewarm, and in fact I would say they were cold to these complaints which were coming in. And the employers at the same time sought to overcome the rise in cost of production where they were complying with the code. So they undertook what is called by the textile workers the stretch out.
They were trying to make up the difference by pushing the workers harder there to produce more and to do more work on fewer hours, to have fewer people tending more machines, and this may have been, it was a management efficiency technique, is basically what it was.
Certainly, we don't ever want to employ somebody and work them too much. You understand? What is too much? You've got to be efficient in your setup. And there's a lot of competition when there's overproduction.
Some of the plants never did stretch out, but most of them did. They cut off half,
loaded the next man up with his job. And it began to be where you was running 3 jobs for the price of 1. And the more that happened, the more they was inviting the unions to the South.
Ta-ra-ra, boom, yay, ain't got a word to say. They chiseled all my pay, then took my job away. Boom went the boom one day, it made a noise that way. I wish that I'd been wise, next time I'll organize.
We were angry. We mill workers were angry because the laws were being violated. We knew enough about the laws to know that they had been enacted to help us. And when we saw that they were not being carried out, that the discrimination and the stretch-out system and all of these other complaints were still going on.
Union membership multiplied during this period. People were looking for outlets.
The year was one of violent labor troubles and strikes.
The period of 1933 and 34 are periods of historically high number of strikes, bitter strikes, prolonged strikes.
When we would hear what was happening in other places, like in the big cities, in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, we were a little bit apprehensive about it to start with, because it was always told to us as something very violent, something that these people were doing that wasn't exactly right. But we did listen to it. And then among ourselves, we would talk about, well, those people are in bigger cities than we are. Those people are smarter than we are. The people were aware of this new freedom and protection, and they were taking advantage of it. And then we began to feel that we could be a part of a great movement. You know, that we wouldn't be one little individual group down here. That was a wonderful feeling.
This wasn't the first time that efforts were made to organize the textile workers in the South. There were other efforts. In the 20s, they had strikes up there, the like of which nobody would believe, and they organized. Primarily, all of these were 1 mills, 2 mills, 1 town, things of that kind. This wasn't that. This was all over the South, wherever the mill was, almost without exception.
The heat of disgust and abuse had just risen to such a level that the workers in one state, Alabama, I think it was about 20 mills, unionized mills, just went out on strike of their own before the general strike without getting permission from anybody.
I guess I took this style on strike. Well, when you get hungry enough and your baby starts crying, you fight back. So that's what we did.
There was a convention of the United Textile Workers in August, and one of the primary subjects was, we want to strike. And this was primarily coming out of the South.
And I was a delegate to that convention, and I was simply amazed when we visited the rooms of some of the people that were delegates, especially from the South. They were very poor. Some of them were involved in a strike in Alabama, which had started before even the general strike. And you'd walk in and you'd find 5, 6 people staying in one room because they had no money in those days.
It was just one of the biggest meetings that I had ever attended. I said, I cannot believe they call these people lintheads. Some of them had some good speeches at the meeting. They were very encouraging, and of course all the speeches were up. You know, there was nothing down. Nobody ever said we're going to fail.
Nobody said we're going to lose the battle.
The work overload has brought employment to the lowest peak we have known under the code. Our people have been discharged for belonging to the Union. There are thousands of such cases. A year of talk has brought us nothing but more and more evasion and delay. Because every other method has failed, the strike must now begin. It will be effective, and it will succeed.
And when the strike took place, overnight, it was a rush, just like a migration of people who suddenly had seen a new idea or a new light, and out they came. It amazed everybody.
People estimate that there were more than 400,000 people on the strikes all over the country. It was the most dramatic event short of war, because there was no precedent for it in American history.
That's the reason so many of them responded when that strike came, because that was the revolution. It was a revolution not of despair, but of hope.
At the beginning of the strike, we didn't know how widespread it was going to be. And we were really elated when we found out, you know, well, this is going on everywhere. Everybody else is thinking just like we are.
We had a very enthusiastic crowd there, and the song that we sang was "I Shall Not Be Moved." That's something I remember very well. It's just, "I shall not be moved."
On that whole crowd there, you couldn't find a black in there that was in that parade. The blacks were scared. That's right. They was afraid to be lynched.
They started coming out so fast he couldn't keep up with it. So we sat down and we started thinking, well, why don't we get a group of people together and have them go from one mill to another, flying squadrons, and help bring them out of the plant. When they brought them out, sign them up, and we'll get a flying squadron in this area, another one in this area, another one in this area, and that way we can cover a lot more than the handful of organizers.
And this group started out in this plant, and they went to another one, and another group went, and it was just like, it built like wildfire.
Oh, we might carry a stick or something once in a while. We didn't carry any weapons that anybody could have been hurt with. We didn't take guns or knives or anything like that.
We went up there to get them to come out of the mill and organize.
People would filter out of the mill, come down the steps, and as they did, everybody would shout, "Hooray! Oh, come on!" You could hear some of the machines cutting off. And then after a while, so many people had come out and joined the group that everything closed down. It was, well, I don't think you'd call it a deathly silence, but it was a quiet that prevailed there. Then they really shouted.
Fellow workers, we want peace and prosperity in this country here. That's what we're fighting for, and that's what we're going to have.
Strikers were on the warpath. My father, Caldwell Reagan, the superintendent, Mr. Miller, were all sitting in the office not knowing what was going to happen. They knew that things were going on, and I'm sure they must have been receiving telephone calls from other places at the time, but unknown to them, the hundreds of the flying squadrons hit the Reagan Spinning Company at 11 o'clock. They stormed the mill gate, entered the door, pulled the switches, stopping the frames, doing minor damage, and my father went out to talk with him. He was naturally very upset and very angry. One of the things he said is that it was a damnable outrage
that something like this could happen in a civilized country. And the mill owners immediately took means to protect their property.
People were deputized, you know, that's my daddy there on the left-hand side. And they deputized them to keep the Union out.
The mill owners got them ammunition for their guns, and these men would stay at the mill to protect the mill property.
During the strike, we had so much criticism, and I felt that some of our criticism was coming from people who really didn't understand what the strike was about. So I wrote a letter to the editor of the Knoxville News-Sentinel in September of 1934. We're not out on strike just because the other fella is. We're out to eliminate sweatshops, starvation wages, and stretch-out systems that have no place in this country. And we're willing to make all sacrifices in order to win a just cause. We want to see our country come out of the Depression, but we know there must be a more equitable sharing of profits before we have complete recovery. The textile workers realize this, and if strike they must, strike they will. The first few days on the picket line, it was fun. Oh, that's fun, carrying these banners. But as time went on, and by the end of the week, no paychecks coming in, by the end of the week, it wasn't so much fun.
Oh, that picket line, we did everything good and right and bad, and everything like that, but we didn't let them even know we worried, because we danced and well and sang.
There was not enough food for everybody who needed it. They were getting the necessities, meal and flour and lard and beans and rice, sort of like it is today in some of the foreign countries. They were just glad to get it.
We have teams to go out to stores to gather food, gather donations, go to union meetings and ask for donations. Because the union didn't have much money.
During this strike, we had all those fundamentalist preachers against us. And it was very hard to talk unionism and trade unionism and picket lines to people all week to have a preacher tear that down on Sunday.
But I do know that without the Lord, you'll never win.
And the only churches who really stood by us and helped us in any way at all was the Catholics and the Jewish church.
Well, there's a lot of people that didn't want the strike because we all needed work so badly till we was afraid if we got into that we would lose our job completely. So our parents wouldn't let us get into it.
It was mighty hard working in the plants now back in those days, because those men and women that was out on strike, a lot of them were kin folks. They passed us on the street, they wouldn't talk to us, wouldn't speak to us. It was mighty rough.
And I was able to sit on my porch where I lived and see the scene of conflict or confrontation that was taking place between strikers, non-strikers. It was confrontational and not always pleasant. But then when the National Guard came on the scene, the confrontational aspect of it took on a more serious turn, because the National Guard was armed and their purpose was to keep order, and I'm not sure they were well trained or sufficiently well prepared for the responsibility they were assuming.
You see, a lot of these boys that was in the Home Guard here, they worked in the mill. Yeah, most of them worked in the mill.
Our rifles were not loaded. We done everything according to orders. We wanted to keep the mills running. That was our motive.
The National Guard, Home Guard, was used as a strike-breaking tool. It was not just to preserve peace, which was the legal basis for their being there, to prevent riot and what have you, but they were used to break the Union, to break the strike, to intimidate the workers.
You know, people, they was upset because they didn't know what was coming next, because the governor called out the troops against them, and the people didn't know what was going to happen, whether it was going to be a shooting war or whether they was going to have a job after it was all over. Well, what I saw happen in Belmont, it got so ripped up, it got dangerous.
Well, one evening, the man who had come to support the people on strike was wounded by a National Guardsman, and he died from the wound.
They didn't have a right to follow him back across that, run him in the house and stab him. They did that to one, and he bled to death.
When people start getting killed, then the tension rises and everybody becomes opinionated one way or the other. Some people might have said, oh, I'm glad it happened, you know. Just shows them a thing or two. Others would say, it isn't worth it.
Dan Beecham, the superintendent of Chicola Mill, was also mayor of Honey Pie. He had everything tied up to where no one could do anything unless the union came in. And he would kill these people before he would let that happen. Uncle Jesse tried to organize a union and they fired him. But the people kept talking about bringing this union in. Mommy begged Daddy not to go up there. She said someone's going to get killed on those grounds if they try to go in that mill. He had left about 45 minutes when she heard the shooting start. And she knew what was going on. No, I don't know how Mr. Beecham got these men to do what he wanted. He placed these men in the windows of the mill. They were firing on their neighbors, the people they had grown up with, had worked with, but when they started shooting, people just started running. They were running away from the mill. They shot them in the back, most of them. And my daddy was across the street. They shot him 5 times, twice in the back, 3 in the front. Some said that he was killed because he was Uncle Jess Mitchell's brother-in-law.
When we heard the news at Honey Path, South Carolina, they killed them strikers, 7. And we decided we'd go down to the funeral. So
he was Uncle Jess Mitchell's brother-in-law.
When we heard the news at Honey Path, South Carolina, they killed them strikers, 7. And we decided we'd go down to the funeral. So my daddy, being the president of our local, he wanted to go. So I think it's about 5 of us went down. And we went in every home where the strike was laying in the casket. They took us around the mill where they shot. That whole thing there, where they shot them people, that goes to show they murder to kill a union. Nobody was guilty killing them 7. And they knew who done the shooting. They knew they didn't shoot him. They didn't care.
There were around 10,000 came to those funerals. They would not allow these men's funerals to be preached in those churches.
They buried all them people over under an oak tree, preached a funeral over under an oak tree. They didn't take them to the churches, they tore all the churches up. Took them a long time to get over that.
Some people ain't over it till yet.
Families, friends, and co-workers of deceased strikers of Honea Pass, South Carolina. The cruel and senseless death of the 6 strikers at Honea Pass has profoundly dismayed and shocked the members of the General Strike Committee of the United Textile Workers of America.
Dear Mr. President, in Honea Pass, South Carolina, there were 6 people killed and more than a score injured this morning. We appreciate the right to organize and bargain for our rights and know that you are behind us 100%. I ask you, the leader of our great nation, to halt the still operating industries and prevent any further bloodshed until an agreement can be reached. The union leaders are not, I don't believe, asking for too much. Trusting in you to lead us out of this and praying for you to be directed by the Almighty God, I am yours very respectfully, Mrs. Dottie Henry.
When we heard about the violence that was going on, we were wondering what has happened to these rules and laws that we have that were supposed to protect us.
There were rumors the governor was going to call the National Guard out to try and pick up the flying squadrons. Where are the flying squadrons? Well, the only activity that he knew was the one that was the Noonan group. They rolled down there. They intercepted the flying squadron, both men and women. The charges were anywhere from treason, insurrection, riot.
They thought we was up there to maul them with them sticks, I guess, but we wasn't gonna hit nobody. But we wasn't up there very long till the guards come, put us on that truck. We didn't know where they was taking us.
They hauled the men and women to Fort McPherson, which is here in Atlanta. We found that they had put them in the area where the internment of German prisoners had taken place during the World War. What that did was to destroy the flying squadrons, because then people knew that they risked getting locked up, put in jail, interned, or whatever it was. The talk among the trade union people at that time was, they don't treat us any better than they did the enemy.
I'm not ashamed of being there, because I didn't do nothing that was so terrible. Nothing except join the union.
Well, it created fear in the hearts of the workers. No question about that. They were afraid. They were afraid of their jobs. They were afraid of their livelihood. They were afraid for their children. And the federal government stood by and permitted this to go on. That was a terrible image of our country, to have something like this.
Franklin Roosevelt, it is to you that we appeal. Our last vestige of hope lies in our wholehearted confidence in your impartial leadership. Mothers have been insulted, beaten on the picket line by hired thugs. The workers were in a destitute circumstance before the strike. The county welfare officers haven't even investigated our appeals for welfare relief, and our jobs are threatened if we don't return to work. At the present time, there's no alternative. We fight or we starve. Your intervention is help. It is in desperation that I appeal to you to stop this transgression on the rights of labor at the hands of greedy, profit-snatching exploiters of labor.
Many suggestions went to Roosevelt to solve this problem. The president appointed Governor Winant of New Hampshire as a chairman of the board. They submitted recommendations which the president adopted and which brought an end to the strike.
What we understood the settlement of the strike was, nobody was discriminated against, everybody got their job back, and to the extent that it was possible to relieve suffering of people who were not working, they would be put to work as fast as they could be, and possibly sooner than that. It didn't turn out that way.
The manufacturers and the cotton mill owners didn't carry out the agreement. The people were not put back to work. People like me, who went to the gate and was told that I was blacklisted. Well, that was discrimination. So evidently, when our national union and the government was working out that agreement, they didn't realize how hostile these cotton mill owners were going to be.
When they started hiring them back, they'd come up to the office desk, you know, and you give them the name, they'd look on the list. If you was on the list, it was goodbye Charlie. See, they wouldn't hire you back. They had on there whatever you done, all the things you'd said.
When you employ somebody, you want to look them up, you understand? You want to know something about anybody you're hiring out. We paid much more attention to that than we ever did. Yes. And if we knew a person was person wanted to organize us, I certainly wouldn't be in favor of bringing him into our company. I knew that. Why bring him in? Why look for trouble?
All right, 105 is Fred Turner. That's me. My brother and myself were blackballed from this company. And people, they come out, everywhere they say you'd have to have a recommendation from your last employee before they could hire you.
Cotton textile industry dismissed the president's order. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were never re-employed.
I don't know whether they call that a blacklist or not, but they certainly wouldn't hire them across the street, the mill. If they had a trouble over here, I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Gilmer Atwell, I know him. L.A. Cook, that was my husband. M.E. Russell. I can't hardly place Russell. Annie Cook, Grace Rollins.
Back then, if you was blackballed in the mill, you was pretty well blackballed. You know what I mean? You had no way to make an income. So the textile owned about everything.
E.W. Washington Sparehand employer 1 year. O.L. Cash run frames employment 8 years.
They went around to all those with a letter that if we would sign that letter that we would never mention the word union ever again in the plant, if they could work. And all of we who did not sign it are the ones that didn't have a job. They laid off the ones that didn't sign the paper. The ones that was in the plant houses, they threw them out on the sidewalk, clothes and all. One particular family, I'll never forget, they had a little invalid
boy, 12 years old. He had 4 little children. They sat them on the sidewalk in the rain with that baby on the cot and watched him die. You could go up and down that street there in that cotton mill village and all over town and find the people on the sidewalks, on the streets, and on the shelters because they had no place to go and no job.
Zona Chandler, Dusty Morris, Harry Sarrington, Maddie Jones, Irene Brooks,
Alma Spreading, Ruby Spreading, C.H. Phillips, Arthur Duncan, I know him.
Mary Murphy, Lucille Murphy.
People were not being put back to work. The National Recovery Administration fixed up these forms that were complaints of violation of the Code of Fair Competition for the textile industry. We got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these signed, and we sent them in to the board to see whether or not we could get something done. That was the Wynant board that was set up by Roosevelt.
I went back to work when the strike was over. They said they do not need me.
We went back to our job. They wouldn't hire them back to hell them off with machine guns.
We'd be sending the complaints into Washington, and very little was done. It took us months before we had the first hearing. When they did get hearings, they didn't do anything for us. Our people were already being starved out, our people were being evicted. And the very few that we got back to work were the ones who either had not been on the picket line or the ones who they felt that they could domineer or that they would not be for the union in the future.
They came down to see me one time. It had to do with the union, said that we weren't fair to them or something like that. And at that time, you know, they were looking into everything, that Washington group, and they sent somebody down and went over all these things. And I just had the lawyer, and he had the records and everything, and nothing came out of it.
The mill fired them for belonging to a union, blacklisted them so they could not get another job in the mill, which raises the question, what did the mill owners suggest happened to these people?
All of us who was laid off that had to rent, well, there wasn't one out of 100 of the landlords that would keep us in the houses. We had to find some other place to live. We lived outdoors, indoors, under shelters, and was one place or another. My children and I have lived in hay barns on the side of the road. We made it.
The Chicola Mill offered Mom a settlement, if you call it a settlement, of a job for life, that she would never be fired. And it was kind of like, this is it. You take it or leave it. Well, she had no other choice. No one would let Mom or any of the wives testify as to what they knew. It was just as if it was an open and closed case. People just seemed to be working to keep their families together and to get over what they had just gone through. It was just if it was to be dropped and no more discussion about it.
Well, I've always considered Knoxville my home. My whole family lives here, and this is where I wanted to stay. I thought that this is my town as much as it is management's. I knew that I was a good cotton mill hand, but here I was blacklisted. No other business in Knoxville was going to give me a job.
This was a revolution of 500,000 people. How do you feed 500,000 people? How do you found houses for 500,000 people? We couldn't overcome it. That's why I get so mad when they say that we walked off and left them. We didn't walk off and leave them. We sweated blood, trying to take care of them. We couldn't. And the people who suffered, instead of being mad at the boss, because he wouldn't take them back. The propaganda was, you see what happened? The union got you out on strike, and now they walked off and left you.
We tried to keep our local union together here, and we did for a while. And then it began to disintegrate because, frankly, they were afraid. They were afraid to get too active in the labor movement. I wasn't. I had nothing to lose. I was blacklisted anyway. So I joined the American Federation of Government Employees at TVA when I went to work there. And I was back in the labor movement then, full-time, for 36 years. I didn't want everything that we had learned through this strike to be wasted, and I don't think it was.
They say it's a failure. To me, it was not a failure. Alabama gained some good, strong, viable local unions out of that strike. In Huntsville, Jasper, Cordova, Winfield, Prattville, Anniston.
Part of the good that came out of the textile strike, a lot of the legislation that took place, which improved labor conditions. The textile barons had promised Roosevelt that they would return the people to work and would not discriminate against them or blacklist, and they turned around and double-crossed him on it. As a result of it, instead of it being a voluntary labor relations set up in this country, he pushed for the National Labor Relations Act and other labor laws that came along later. From my position, I could see it possibly more objectively, and that was what good did come out of it and what changes it did make. And they saw the union as a means of improving their lives in the mill where they made their living. And when the strike came along, they responded to it because they wanted a voice. And for a while, it was their voice. Some stayed with their philosophy of how they could improve themselves, and others tried to blank it out. Many of them went back to the farms. Many of them came to bigger towns. Some of them migrated even into the east and north, where there were unions which they knew would help them. Many of them did what they could until they had a chance again.
Never dawned on me to be afraid. I mean, I felt like that the cause for which most of the people were fighting was a cause that would touch a lot of people, the lives of men and women today and their children's children on down. It was not just a fight for the day or for the period, it was for on down, forever.
My father, John Pollard, was a union organizer, and when I was about 18, 19, I went to work out of high school, and at that point, I went to work for a big mill in town. Active as my father was in unions or organizing in the county, and the only mention to me he made was, make sure you don't mention being related to John Pollard. You won't be hired. Said it will get you in trouble. And to this day, I guess I have not mentioned that I have been related to him.
At one time, I tried to talk to my father about union, and he told me, he says, well, at one time there was a union, and they came in, and they took the money from the people, and they left them high and dry. I've had people who walk up to me and tell me I don't like union people. You know, but I say I'm not a union person. I'm just a person who wants to fight for my rights.
Everything in the South is handed down. It's like tradition. If your mother did it, you do it. And when you have children, you say, well, my mother and my grandmother did it, so you do it that way. And the pain's been passed to them. And their children and their children's children. And it's time. It's long been overdue. It's time.
All right, so that was the Uprising of 34. Once again, a wonderful and important documentary about labor organizing in the South during the Great Depression. So what we're going to do now is first, Dr. Taylor is going to give some remarks about the film, about the events portrayed in the film and its aftermath. And while doing so, I will present a couple of his PowerPoint slides as well. Then we'll get to an audience Q&A too. So Dr. Taylor, the floor is yours.
Wow. Yeah, yes, I was thinking this is I'm trying to think when I first saw the film. I mean, I almost couldn't have been too long after the film was released. So I've shown it dozens of times in all kind of different contexts, and I think what I wanted to talk about is maybe three things that I kind of frame as sort of what I think of as the afterlives of Uprising 34. And the first of which kind of continues with what Brett had mentioned, is just the heroic struggle that it took to have this film shown in the Carolinas. So Uprising 34 was released in 1995, and it was part of the public television's POV series, which means every public television station has the option to show it across the country, and virtually all of them did, except for in the Carolinas. It was a number of the stations in North Carolina refused. Chapel Hill and maybe Charlotte were a couple of those who did show it, and then SCTV refused to show it for 3 years, and so it fell upon organizations like the Carolina Alliance for Fair Employment and the labor movement to try to just creatively get this film shown. Cafe in Easley rented out a community hall to show the film, and it turns out that community hall was run or owned by the Chamber of Commerce. So they were booted at the last minute and were forced to book some space at the county library. Um, I think it was Charlotte, and Brett, you might have a clear recollection of this. Might have been in Charlotte, where the labor movement pulled together some money for a showing. They bought airtime after public TV refused to show it, but all they could afford was like a 2 a.m. showing of the film. So if you were able to stay up into the early morning, you had a chance of seeing Uprising 34. Eventually, I guess change of management at SCTV led to the showing of the film in 1998, so 3 years after its release. But I think that's really important, just to keep in mind that the sort of grassroots spirit that's represented in the film, that really continued into the 1990s, and it continued to be a struggle and continues to be a struggle to have these stories heard. I was also thinking, and I want to encourage any of you who are interested in doing an even deeper dive, that the Southern Labor Archives at Georgia State has all of the full interviews transcribed and digitized, as well as some archival footage. And much, if not all of that information is available online through the Southern Labor Archives. So I'd encourage any of you to check out the full interviews and some of the material that did not make it into the final cut. And I'm really happy to see that over the last couple semesters, that some of this material is showing up in the work of my master's students, which is just really great to see that they're tapping into the all this great material that the filmmakers generated. And then the third thing I was thinking about is in the context of a book that's been very important to me over the last couple of years. This is Michael Goldfield's Southern Key. And I'm not sure if that's something that I don't know if that's been included in the curriculum or if there's been any mention of that. But if not, I'd certainly encourage you to take a look at that on your own. But it also might be the topic for a future class. But Goldfield offers, I think, what a lot of us, I think, kind of know or intuit that really this has been an important principle for or assumption of I think a lot of our approaches to organizing. But Goldfield really makes this point that the difference, if we think about the lack of a whether it's framed as a lack of a socialist movement or the lack of a deeper um, tradition of left politics in the United States, Goldfield puts that all on the South and the inability of the labor movement to really gain any kind of sustainable traction in the South. And he does this by looking at 4 or 5 different industries from a global perspective, but also looks at the Southern story in quite a bit of depth. And it's a very provocative revisionist history, but he does a lot of work with textiles, obviously, and some of his assertions, I think, kind of challenge the filmmakers. They challenge the Uprising 34 and challenge some of the assumptions that I've long held about Southern textile. And just as a couple of instances of that is that Goldfield has this, in part of his argument is that Southern textile workers, when given an opportunity, have always demonstrated a level of militancy. It wasn't, 34 was just not this blip, but that it was really a continuation of a strike wave and upheaval in the industry that went back to the late 1920s. And Goldfield also makes this argument that the success or the relative success or the degree to which workers responded enthusiastically to the textile worker organizing committee, organizing campaign of 37 and 38, he suggests that really challenges this idea that comes out of the film that 34 was really the singular event that basically crushed trade unionism in the South. So he's encouraging us to, I think, take a little bit more of a nuanced look at that argument. And a big part of his argument centers on the Textile Workers Organizing Committee and their at least initial success in 37 and 1938, and that was the CIO's kind of effort to replicate their success in steel through the SWOC, the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. They did the same thing in the South, and at least in Goldfield's retelling, there was no lack of enthusiasm on the part of Southern workers, many of whom were working in the same mills that they had been when they went out on strike in 34. So those are just, I guess, a couple things that I've been thinking about with regards to the film, and some of what I've been thinking about, more recently. And so, I'm happy if anyone wants to ask any questions about my remarks, but I'm also really interested, recognizing that I'm talking to a room of organizers and activists. I'm really curious about how it is we might use this film today. And in some ways, I'm asking the same question in a couple different ways here. So to think about Uprising 34, is this film still relevant to South Carolina? Is it relevant to labor organizing? What are some ways we might use this in our own organizing? So with that, let me stop and listen to y'all. And I guess maybe even before, I should really open it up and just say, if I'd love to hear any kind of reactions, especially from those of you who've not seen the film before. Any sort of questions or reactions would be great.
Don't be shy. Go ahead. Speak up.
It's a weighty question, Dr. Taylor.
Well, but who's not seen? For whom was this their first viewing? We'll put some of you on the spot. Anyone? Was this anyone's first time? Hey, and any kind of reaction?
Yes, actually. I'm from a small town in South Carolina, and we were a cotton farming town, and we then became a sewing room. My great grandmother was a union member in the sewing room in South Carolina, and I remember that being something that we were not to talk about. And so it's really cool to see that this, that was probably in the 1940s and 50s, but to see this story in the upstate of South Carolina and North Carolina is amazing. That she was a part of that tradition. And that is still not talked about, like where I'm from. So it's really cool.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. My mother worked in a plant, and I worked there too for a little while in Pickens, and it made motor cores for lawnmowers and power tools and stuff. And I remember when I was younger in the 70s that they tried to get them unionized, and my mother was really excited because in that plant, it was a lot of women that were under men foremen, and they would be pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed to do more and do more and do more. And for not a lot of money. And when the people came around to unionize them, boy, did the management come down. And my mother was really excited, but my mother was she only went through the 6th grade, and this was one of the biggest jobs she had ever had. And she had 3 children that she had to take care of, and they knew this. And she was, like I said, she was excited about unionizing, but she was bullied, and she was told what the results would be, which the worst would be that she would lose her job. And so that unionizing in that plant failed. And when I saw this, I could relate to a lot of these people. I had uncles and aunts that worked in the mills. And it was funny, I told Cecil, one of the things for class 7 was this nice little pert lady telling about the mills in Columbia and how much fun it was, and how much that that families did this, and how nice the house was. And I said, oh boy, what bullshit, I'll just say the word. And I know how hard these people worked in the mill. I know that they were not paid for the hard time that they did. I would see an uncle come home 6 o'clock in the morning, he'd go to work. 6 o'clock at night, he'd come in, and he could, eat supper, and then his day was gone. He was too hard, tired to do anything. And they put their soul and their life into that work. And it was never appreciated, never, ever appreciated, not for what they did. My mother was the same way, and the people she worked with. And when I worked in that plant, it was, just like you were part of that assembly line. And nobody really cared except if you were real fast and could keep that thing going, and then everybody'd have to keep up with the person that was going real fast. So it was not appreciated work. It really wasn't. And I was so proud the day that I took my tools and handed them in to the foreman and said, I'm going to college. I've saved my money and I'm going back to school.
Thank you, Irene.
You're welcome.
Kerry, she referred to a clip that I found poking around that was put together as a promo by a happy-faced woman from one of the television stations that they were doing one of these kind of local interest things about the new museum of the Olympia Mill, which is done by people that I've known for years. They're good people, but the happy face that this woman put on it sounded just like the mill manager saying the children, it didn't mention child labor, but about how the children were happy and they have school and etc. Basically, it was the same thing we heard about the good plantation owners, the way they treated their workers.
Well, I love the thing that she would talk about, that they had at the Olympia Mill, they had this place where they could go swimming and bowl and do this and that. And I thought about, again, my people that worked in the mills, the only exercise that they got was walking home from the mill to go to their house, because they surely were, making enough money to buy an automobile. I mean, that was their amusement for the day.
So
I wonder if this might be an opportunity for us, what they call white folk, to get a glimmer of insight into what is like with this happening at the peak of Jim Crow.
Jimmy, that was what I was thinking when Dr. Taylor was talking about Mr. Goldfield saying that we didn't have a socialist movement in this country. We're the only industrialized nation that only has two parties that represent the bosses. And so you got to start there. And if you look at what's happened in all over Europe, they're mostly members of the union on the boards of directors that own the corporations. And so there's real structural problems here that have been sustaining the type of white supremacist wealthy people running the show since the show was created. And I do believe that notion of privilege was something that was real clear when the white workers at least could come in the front door of the mills.
Dr. Taylor, I was really appreciate the framing that you had about how can we keep this going, and what kind of audiences can we pull in that might not have seen this before, and or how can we use it as an organizing tool, because it's as relevant as it's ever been, I believe. And as a journalist, I just really appreciate the skill that went into gathering those interviews and piecing together a really complex history. For people that don't have a lot of patience, it doesn't seem like, and if they're resistant to it already, that's already built in. So you're trying to knock through that on top of just this resistance to being fully educated in South Carolina and other places. But I'm just, Brett and I have taken a lot of comfort and inspiration from what seems to be just recently, at least in our spheres, about organized labor in South Carolina. And I would wonder if that's a fair assessment, or we're just really desperate for good news. And also, that Cafe Worker Center, which is happening in Charleston, which seems to be getting some traction. I'm just wondering if there's a way that we can harness all of that energy, or at least some of that energy. And I think it's got to be packaged in another way, perhaps, to engage people in a meaningful way, which is like not a one-off thing, but maybe like a series that, have this as a center of discussion about a larger issue. And how do you broaden this issue out? We've got the campus workers and all these different factions, but how do you knit it all together? I'm especially interested in younger people that are just becoming exposed to this and excited by it, and it's so relevant. And I'm just, thank you for the question. And you've asked it before, and I'm wondering what kind of ideas you've heard from people that we could, use. And thank you for being here.
Just quickly go back to something that Brett mentioned, and just to say a little bit more about this. This came out of a particular moment. It is about the same time that the Southern Oral History Program was conducting interviews with mill workers and mill families for the production of Like a Family, which was a award-winning book about the Southern textile industry. And I think both with Like a Family, with Uprising 34, it also gave rise to kind of a little bit of a backlash, which may have been, Brett, some of what you were experiencing. But there were a number of former mill workers who this inspired them to conduct their own interviews, because they felt that there was too much emphasis on strife, and what they remembered from their experience was a much more cohesive and united community. And these were very unpleasant memories for them or is an unpleasant experience to watch the film and to hear about the events at Honeopath. If you look at some of the documentation work that's been done around the Coolamy mills, which Brett, I think that's your old friend Lynn Wells is behind the effort to document the Coolamy mill community. But I think that's an example of some of the work that came as a kind of negative response to all of what I think is this great work, Becky, that you alluded to. In terms of so I'm not sure how best to, I was asking that question really, I think for the same reason you asked it, is I'm curious. I want to know what people have done, how they've used this film, or how they think it might work. I asked, as part of one of my questions was, well, maybe I'll leave it at that. Like, what have people done? Because I know I would say almost every time I've shown the film, I get responses like a couple of those that I just heard, that people are they're excited, they're shocked that they never knew these stories, that they're able to relate it to some of their own family experiences, that it helps them understand the depths of kind of our anti-union culture. So for all of those reasons, I think people find it that they resonate. Sometimes I wonder, though, do they resonate as individual viewers? And I wonder what sort of utility this film would have in the context of collective struggle or labor struggle. And maybe that's a question for the school.
That's a question.
I don't know if anyone has any responses or any thoughts on that.
I mean, we have like 5 minutes left, so I don't know. We have a whole lot of time.
Oh, okay, yeah,
but
yeah.
That's a question we should think deeply about, because it is a really important question.
Excuse me, Robert. Dr. Taylor, you gonna be able to be with us tomorrow night?
I will be back. Yeah. I might be a little bit late, but I will return.
this film is to provoke that discussion tomorrow. Mr. Rigby has.
Definitely. Yeah, Cecil, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. You're always really insightful, and I appreciate it. And I've seen the movie before. It had brought to mind the first time I saw it. There is a relation of mine through in-laws of a grandmother that worked at the Belton plant, and also in Anderson County, where Honeypath is, and just several miles apart. A lot of those mill workers in Belton joined with the Honeypath workers at that strike. She was given an ultimatum. You can strike, you can march, you can do all that. And she didn't. She was afraid, like my wife was telling about her family. And later on, they gave her the option. Okay, so you didn't strike, you didn't do all that. We can guarantee you a house for life if you'll stay out of the union from here on out. And she took it because she was afraid, like my wife was saying. There's a lot of history of this kind of activity here in the upstate, of course. Greenville was a mill village to start with, where I grew up. The Marchant family, well known, the Victor Mill, Monaghan Mill, the Parker Mills, stone manufacturing, the whole gamut. And Mr. Marchant Sr. was adamantly against everything that the New Deal was bringing. He even went to Washington and lobbied and took a case to the Supreme Court. You know, the mill workers were asking Governor Blackwood for support because they knew the mills were breaking the law, but he was afraid too, and about the uprising causing violence. Of course, that's what ended up happening. So I think one of the answers for today, you know, you always get these beautiful and well-received oral history projects like this one. I think one of the problems is they're always after the fact. Where are the letters to the editor today about what people are suffering at the hands of our governing bodies? You know, and I kind of wondered, I posted in chat, you know, is Governor McMaster willing to send the National Guard too, you know, to keep the automobile plants here from unionizing? So it is relevant, as Becky said, but I think it requires people to tell their stories. That's what helps change things. Anytime you go to a meeting of a committee in Columbia where one group is trying to get some benefit, they always start by talking about how I am personally affected by what you're going to be deciding. And we need to do that proactively rather than after the fact. And I would just suggest this school is a wonderful place to gather those kinds of stories and put them in a series of editorials. Why not? With that, I'll hush. Thanks.
That could actually be a good project for when the school is finishing up this year. We'll come back to that, Cecil. We'll come back to that idea. I like it a lot. Brett, you had your hand up?
Well, it looks like Eva has.
Yeah, thank you. I won't take long, but I do agree that it is relevant. And I know my mother and my grandmother worked at factories here in Spartanburg. And I also wanted to say that it's interesting. I noticed in the documentary how they felt that the jobs were pretty good jobs. The statement, you keep a man hungry and he'll work. And for me, that brings to mind the low wages that a lot of workers have to endure, that they are subjected to working 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. And one of the other participants there said that they were good to us. And it, you know, the perspective and the need to have someone feel that you really care about them is what they did. And the last thing I'll say is that our organization here, Ubuntu Institute for Community Development, We support the Southern Workers Assembly. And in fact, coming Thursday, we'll have a meeting to discuss with people who have issues with where they work to help them learn about workers' rights. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Dr. Green, I want
One other thing,
wrap
it
it up.
occurred to me that we have the Black Textile League baseball groups, and not all of them were Black entirely, but that's where a lot of the Black people could be participatory and have some benefit. And some of them went on to larger leagues after that. There were many of those such textile leagues here in South Carolina.
So Dr. Green, the only thing I wanted to say before we wrap it up is that this is not a history lesson. This is like learning the past, so our strategies in the present improve the future. And we know that the history doesn't repeat itself exactly. It rhymes, though they say. But what we have to know, and what we will unpack some tomorrow on, is that the oppressors are smart and organized. And so they change their nature of oppression. And what we're seeing today in terms of anti-union attitudes is different than it was then. And so that's what we'll talk about some tomorrow, is who are the lobbyists now that are depriving South Carolina from actually having healthcare on the job. And so it's basically the people that are running the show at the State House, the people with the money. Dr. Green? Thank you, Kerry.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Taylor, for joining us today. And there is one last question in the chat. And Dr. Taylor, if you could take a few seconds to answer this. Jennifer Thel White has a great comment in the chat about her parents being from Southern Alabama and them having a distaste for unions, not really trusting them, that sort of thing. And she posed a great question. Why does this history exist of terms of union distrust amongst poor Southerners in particular?
Pieces of answers, and it's there's no one no one reason, but I think it really does have to do with just a combination of in many instances these jobs were really a lifeline for people who were absolutely destitute, leaving farms. This was their first opportunity to participate in the market, to make a wage, and that kind of loyalty, living in a mill village, shopping at the company store, attending a church that was purchased, financed by the mill company, living in mill housing. As we're all aware of the dangers of that, but that meant something to people, and those people that they identified with their employers. I mean, it's the same thing with the steel workers in Chester County today, that we could look at the disastrous record on safety. We could look at those wages compared to other steel workers or other industrial workers across the country, but for many workers in Chester County, those are they are a lifeline. There's the historical divides of race that in the Carolinas, that these jobs were reserved for white workers really until the Civil Rights Act began to desegregate the industry just in time for all the jobs to be shipped off to Latin America. Is when the I think it was 95 when the Act 2 finally won at the plant in Kannapolis, and a few months later the plant was shut down. But race would certainly figure into to all of this. And then it's you learn these lessons, loss after loss. It becomes a you know, in a lot of ways, it's a rational choice to say, no, I'm not going to get involved in that again. The price was too high. You know, I lost my job. I lost friends. You know, so for all those reasons, I think, you know, those attitudes are, you know, that they run deep in the culture. So you know, that's the start of an answer, but that's imperfect, and I could go on, you know, much longer. I would, anybody, you know, I will be back tomorrow night, but if anybody wanted to get in touch with me, I'm going to put my email in the chat. Don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Yes, Kerry.Taylor@citadel.edu. All right, folks. So again, tomorrow evening at 6:30, we'll be back here, same bat time, same bat channel, except this time we'll be talking a bit more about South Carolina and the struggle for human rights during the Great Depression and World War II eras, tying in elements of race and labor organizing during that time period. And by the end of 1945, we're going to see a militant human rights movement taking root in the Palmetto State.